So Jada, why don't you start? Here we go.
Yeah.
So just to give a little bit of context, because I think there are some common responses that happen when these type of issues show up in our culture. And so I want us to just be very aware of how, as men and women, we think things that may be responses that can keep us from really leaning into restoration and reconciliation like we should. And one of the common responses that I see when people post things about what's happening in our society is that all races and all lives matter. And this is absolutely true. But number one, there is an insensitivity to that kind of response, because when my friend calls me and tells me that her child is sick and she posts about children with autism, I don't say all special needs children matter. I say, I want to feel your pain where you are.
Yeah.
And so we have to be cognizant of that fact. And secondly, we have to realize that all races and all lives matter. However, we are in a cultural context that has a uniqueness to it, and that is the long-term systemic dehumanization of Black people. And so we have to be aware that this is our reality. This is part of the history of our nation. And so we have to be able to embrace that as we would with any other race discussion. We would embrace the uniqueness of that race in our culture.
Right.
So in this discussion, we have to embrace the uniqueness of how African Americans came to be here and what their experience has been thus far.
Yeah.
The second thing we hear often is that all sins are bad and all crime matters. Why don't you post about abortion? Why don't you talk about child abuse? Well, there's a couple of things with that. Abortion and child abuse do not seem to create the divide in the church like race issues do.
Right.
No one is arguing that abortion is okay. No one is saying let's get the details of the facts when it comes to child abuse. Somehow we seem to all agree generally that these things are horrific and wrong. But when it comes to race issues, there seems to be such a clear divide that African Americans tend to have to defend why their pain is valid, because now our pain becomes something that's conditional on the details of the facts.
Yeah.
And again, when I'm standing at the gravesite or at the hospital bed of a friend who's looking at a loved one, I don't say, give me the details of why they got sick. I mourn with you first. And so all crime is horrible, all sin does matter, but there is a uniqueness to the situation that's happening here, and we have to be very aware of it. For African Americans, I hear a lot of times that, white people just don't get it. And I tell them they probably don't, because they're not Black. And so I think there is a tension with this idea that the average white person is not living in our shoes every day. And that is very important for us to initiate conversations. But for African Americans, we also have to be aware that as human beings, none of us intentionally live in the shoes of another. We are all self-centered. We live in our perspective. It's not until you have a child that has special needs that you care about the Special Olympics, right? And so while this is important that people who are not Black don't get it, that cannot be an excuse to not engage. We want to say, we know you don't get it. It would be impossible for you to fully get it. So let's initiate conversation. Another one that I hear is, why do we keep bringing up the past? I hear this all the time that it's history, it's done, the laws have changed. And frankly, I think that the past really wasn't that long ago that my parents can remember Jim Crow. And so the past really isn't as far back as you think it is. And the past is important, because when you go to a doctor's office and you complain of an issue, he doesn't just say what happened today.
Wow.
He wants to know your medical history. And he doesn't want to know your medical history so he can hold it over your head, not to beat you down. You cannot have a solid diagnosis if he doesn't know the history of your body. And so we cannot address the things we're dealing with today if we don't start with the history. The history is not a guilt stick. The history is not something to shame, but it's something to frame what we're dealing with. It is extremely important. It is dangerous and unhealthy to try to patch up a problem today without understanding the relevance of the past. Another common thing I hear from African Americans mostly is, I'm tired of talking, let's take action. And there's some whites and others that feel the same way, but they're just over the conversation. And one thing I would ask, if you're not Black, to give grace in that space, because I think that the constant trauma that is experienced can take a toll. There's a uniqueness to African Americans that I would say we feel pain collectively more than most cultures. And that doesn't mean that's not right or wrong or good or bad. It's just a fact. When African Americans see someone succeed and get promoted, you don't have to know the person. We feel like, oh, that's one of us. When someone dies or struggles, we feel like that's one of us. And so one of the uniquenesses of our culture, the tribal nature of our culture, is that we feel things collectively. And so it's an important thing for when people say that, they're not racist individually. Okay, we get that, but even if you have not participated in things individually, understanding the collective pain of people that we say we're family with is important.
Yeah.
The other part of that, with the talking and action, I think for African Americans, there's a tension because it's hard to give grace when you feel wounded. But man, at the cost of a cliche, I just keep thinking about Jesus on the cross, what it means to say forgive them. And it doesn't mean forget, it doesn't mean there's no consequences, but it means that action is important, but it's unhealthy if it's uninformed. And so we have to have conversations. So let's not skip the talking and go to action. I think we can do both in a healthy way. And a couple of more. African Americans, we wrestle with the tension between ethnicity and Christianity. Very often we find ourselves not knowing where we fit. And when we start to resonate with other black groups and what they're doing, if you are really going hard for the gospel, they're probably going to cross a line where you say, dang it, but my Christianity doesn't agree with that. Yeah. And now what do I do? And so that's why it's so important for the church, all ethnicities, all races, to bind together, because really the gospel is the common thread.
That's good.
I think it's important to realize that Christian black people in America are in a strong tension to figure out where they can land and how they can function in Christ. And lastly, I'll say this. I get this a lot of times. I'm not a racist, and I don't deal with privilege. I've never done anything racist. And you don't have to individually have committed an action to be able to take some ownership in a culture. When I go outside of this country, or when I talk to people who are not from America, and they say your country has done greedy things, inhumane things, is capitalistic, all you have is money, you're egotistical, that's why you survive. I don't say I didn't kill anybody overseas. I say you're right. And I have to own that and say that I've benefited from the egotism and the capitalism and the greed of my country. Whether or not I've done it directly, I have benefited from this structure. So when we talk about privilege, this is not accusatory. This is awareness. So you can say, I have benefited because of the color of my skin. You don't have to be a racist. It doesn't mean you're hateful. But if you believe in your heart of hearts that your experience as a white person is equal to that of a black person, we cannot come to a real solution because we're not starting in reality. And so these are just a few things to help us frame this conversation so that whether you're white or black or Asian or Hispanic and trying to figure out where you fit in this conversation, maybe this country's history is not your own and you're forming some opinions, we want you to be able to check your own heart, okay, not someone else's. Check your own heart and ask God to really start to dismantle the anthropomorphic or man-centered views that can work against restoration.
That's really, really good. One of the reasons we're doing this is to give you language that you can use as you're interacting with others, and to teach us the discipline of patience while we listen instead of writing people off as we go back and forth in dialogue, because what we're trying to get to is commonality.